They thought they had seen everything in that courtroom. The scandal, the defiance, the shame. But no one, not the press, not the crowd, not even Judge John Roberts himself, was ready for what Jasmine Crockett revealed that day. A secret buried so deep it could have destroyed her long before she ever stepped foot into Congress. A confession so raw, so human, it left even the sternest man on the bench wiping his eyes. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about survival, about truth, and about a moment that would redefine everything. The marble floors of the federal courthouse gleamed under the weight of flashing cameras and restless footsteps. Rows of seats were packed, shoulder to shoulder, with reporters, legal scholars, activists, and silent spectators drawn in by the promise of spectacle. The air inside buzzed with an electric tension thick enough to taste. Somewhere in the back, a young intern gripped a crumpled notepad so tightly that the edges tore under his fingers. At the front of the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett sat rigid, her back straight against the cold wood of the defendant's bench. She wore a simple black dress, no flashy jewelry, no entourage, just herself and the truth she had carried like a hidden wound for nearly 2 decades. Her lawyers flanked her on either side, exchanging nervous glances, but saying nothing. There was nothing left to say. Today wasn't about legal arguments or clever technicalities. It was about survival, not just of a career, but of a reputation, a soul. At the elevated bench, Judge John Roberts adjusted his robe and scanned the room over the rim of his glasses. His face was carved from stone, unreadable, unwavering. To the public, he was the symbol of unshakable law, the immovable pillar against which countless lives broke or found mercy. Today, his gaze settled firmly on Jasmine. The bailiff called the room to order. A hush fell over the crowd so complete that when a woman sneezed quietly in the second row, several heads snapped around. Roberts cleared his throat, his voice low and commanding. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, before we proceed to sentencing, you have been granted an opportunity to address this court." 100 phones poised to record, 1,000 headlines waiting to be written. Jasmine stood slowly, every movement deliberate, every fiber of her being fighting the tremor that threatened to betray her calm. The chains of fear, pride, and shame that had bound her for so long rattled quietly inside her. And for the first time, she chose to break them. She stepped forward, heels echoing softly against the polished floor, and gripped the edges of the wooden podium. The room held its breath. Judge Roberts met her eyes, and for a fleeting second something passed between them. Something neither would be able to explain later. Strength, maybe, or defiance, or perhaps simply the unbearable weight of the truth that was about to be unleashed. Long before the cameras, the rallies, the crisp suits and stern headlines, there was a small apartment on the rough side of Sacramento. It was dim and drafty, a 3rd-story walk-up with peeling paint and a heater that rattled more than it warmed. In that apartment, a teenage Jasmine Crockett learned lessons most kids her age never dreamed of. She learned how to make $50 stretch for a week. She learned how to lie to utility companies to buy a few more days before the lights went out. And she learned something else, something she never spoke of, not even to her closest friends. She learned how to forge signatures. The memory came rushing back unbidden as she stood at the podium, heart pounding in the present but mind spiraling backward. Jasmine had been 16. Her mother, Carla Crockett, was in the hospital again, this time for pneumonia after another grueling round of chemotherapy. The rent was overdue. An eviction notice printed in stark, merciless ink had been taped to their front door that morning. Desperation was a cold, sharp thing. It made your hands steady even when your soul screamed. She remembered sitting at the scratched kitchen table, an eviction form trembling under her fingertips. She remembered copying the landlord's signature from an old lease agreement onto a payment-received receipt she had crafted herself on a borrowed school computer. She remembered slipping it into the apartment office's night drop box, praying, no, begging, that it would buy them another month. It had worked. Somehow, miraculously, it had worked. The landlord never double-checked. Maybe he had too many tenants. Maybe he just didn't care. Maybe, deep down, he knew. Whatever the reason, Jasmine and her mother stayed in that apartment until the chemotherapy ended, until her mother could walk again without help, until survival wasn't a daily negotiation. And then Jasmine buried the memory, beneath the scholarships, beneath the late nights studying law, beneath the polished speeches about justice and integrity, until now, until this courtroom, until this moment. She blinked, clearing the mist from her eyes, and met Judge Roberts's steady gaze again. The night before the hearing, Jasmine sat curled up on her worn leather couch, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Celeste Monroe, her chief of staff and closest confidant, perched on the edge of the coffee table, fidgeting with a pen. "You don't have to tell them," Celeste said, her voice low and urgent. "You know that, right? No one can prove anything. It's buried. It's ancient history." Jasmine said nothing. She just stared up, feeling the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. "Think about it," Celeste pressed on. "You admit to forgery, even under those circumstances, and they will eat you alive. Headlines, ethics committees, opponents. It'll never end." Jasmine closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw her mother's face, hollowed by illness, but still smiling as she whispered, "You have to fight smart, baby, but you also have to fight right. Fight smart, fight right." "If I don't tell the truth," Jasmine said finally, her voice rough, "then everything I fought for means nothing." Celeste's face crumpled for a moment. "I just don't want to see them destroy you." Jasmine sat up slowly, setting her coffee cup aside with a soft clink. "Maybe they will," she said, "but at least I'll know I didn't destroy myself." For a long moment, they just sat there, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Finally, Celeste nodded, the fight draining from her shoulders. "Then you go in there," she said, "and you tell them. You tell them everything." Jasmine leaned back, her hands clasped together tightly. "I will," she whispered. Tomorrow she would stand in front of the world and tear away the last shield she had left, not to save her career, not to win sympathy, but because the truth, even when it hurt, was the only thing worth standing for. The morning sun was bright but cold as Jasmine Crockett climbed the courthouse steps. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very air pressed against her. A wall of reporters surged forward, cameras flashing like angry fireflies, but the bailiffs held them back with firm hands and clipped warnings. Celeste walked beside her, her face a carefully composed mask. Behind them trailed a young aide clutching a battered leather portfolio that held everything Jasmine would need, and nothing that could truly protect her. Inside the courtroom, the mood was different today. Gone was the feverish gossip of the first hearing. In its place was something colder, more solemn. Like everyone understood that today was not just about law, it was about legacy. The pews overflowed with faces, some curious, some hostile, a few quietly supportive. Judge John Roberts sat high on the bench, his robe immaculate, his demeanor severe. He rapped the gavel once, and the low murmur of the crowd evaporated. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, voice cutting clean through the air, "you have requested to address this court prior to sentencing. You may proceed." Jasmine rose slowly. For a moment she simply stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle over her like a second skin. Then she stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and took her place at the center of the storm. She placed both hands on the podium, steadying herself. The room held its breath, and Jasmine Crockett began to speak. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear but low, "and to everyone here today, I have no illusions about how this looks." A few people shifted in their seats, murmuring under their breath. Jasmine pressed on. "I stand before you not just as a congresswoman, but as the daughter of a woman who fought for every breath she took." Her gaze swept the room, meeting eyes both curious and skeptical. "And I'm here to tell you something I have never told anyone." Judge Roberts' eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Jasmine took a steadying breath. "When I was 16, my mother was battling cancer. We were poor. We were scared. And one day, after months of unpaid bills, an eviction notice appeared on our door." A hush fell over the room. Even the clatter of typing reporters slowed. "I forged a payment receipt," she said, the words cracking slightly at the edges. "I copied the landlord's signature, dropped it in the office nightbox. I didn't do it for greed. I didn't do it for ambition. I did it because I was 16 and desperate, and because my mother was too sick to survive on the street." A ripple moved through the courtroom, an RE, a collective, almost involuntary shiver. Jasmine gripped the podium tighter. "I've carried that secret ever since. Carried it into law school, into public service, into Congress. I've fought to be a voice for those who live every day with the kind of fear I knew all too well." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I am not proud of what I did, but I am proud of why I did it." For the first time since she started speaking, Jasmine allowed herself to look directly at Judge Roberts. "If you must judge me, Your Honor," she said quietly, "then judge all of me. Not just the mistake of a desperate child, but the woman who stands here today, not asking for forgiveness, but standing in truth." The silence that followed was a living thing. Reporters sat frozen, pens poised over pads. Activists clutched the edges of their seats. Lawyers blinked in stunned silence. At the bench, Judge Roberts set his pen down with deliberate care. For a long, long moment, he said nothing. And somewhere, deep in the cavernous stillness of the courtroom, something began to shift. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's confession was profound. It stretched through the cavernous courtroom, swallowing every breath, every heartbeat, every whisper. Somewhere near the back, a pen clattered to the floor, its sharp rattle echoing like a gunshot. On the prosecution's side, a young attorney lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. In the gallery, a reporter fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling. The public reaction was a tapestry of disbelief, pity, awe, and a simmering sense of uncomfortable admiration. One woman in the third row, a nurse in scrubs, still wearing her hospital badge, pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. 2 benches over, a prominent political blogger scribbled furiously, already framing the headline. Crockett. From fraud to fighter. On the far left side, an elderly veteran leaned heavily on his cane, nodding slowly to himself. Even the cameras seemed subdued, their blinking red lights somehow less aggressive, as if they too understood the gravity of what had just been laid bare. The walls, the marble, the very air of the courtroom seemed to lean inward, waiting, wondering, unsure how to react to the weight of honesty. For a moment longer, Jasmine simply stood there, hands resting lightly on the podium, not hiding, not shrinking, just standing in her truth. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, someone started clapping. A single tentative clap, then another. Then it stopped, swallowed by the tension, as if even applause was too bold a response. Judge John Roberts had not moved, but his face had changed. Subtly. Enough for those watching closely to notice. The stern lines around his mouth had softened. The rigid set of his shoulders eased. Judge Roberts removed his glasses slowly, folding them with care and setting them on the bench before him. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if composing himself, or perhaps wrestling with something deeper. When he opened them, the room, every soul within it, leaned forward imperceptibly. His voice, when it came, was lower, rougher, stripped of the cold judicial distance he was known for. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, and then paused, clearing his throat. He looked down at his notes, then back at her. "The law is often portrayed as rigid," he continued, "as blind, as unyielding. And yet it was created, must always be created, to serve humanity, not to strip it away." The judge's hand trembled slightly as he picked up his gavel, but did not strike it. "In my years on this bench, I have heard every kind of excuse, every kind of justification. Rare is the soul who stands before this court, not to excuse their actions, but to own them." He paused again, and in that moment Jasmine saw it anew, the glint of moisture at the corner of his eye. John Roberts was blinking back tears. "Your honesty today," he said, voice thick, "does not erase what happened, but it illuminates the spirit in which it happened." He straightened slightly, finding his authority once more. "Considering the extraordinary circumstances, the clarity of your admission, and the service you have since rendered to your community, this court will exercise its discretion." Murmurs rose in the gallery, swiftly hushed by the bailiff. "The previously considered penalties are hereby suspended," Judge Roberts said, tapping the gavel once, gently. The words hung in the air like fireworks that no one dared cheer. Suspended, not erased, not forgotten, but lifted. A second chance, earned not by denial or manipulation, but by a raw, naked offering of the truth. Jasmine bowed her head slightly, not smiling, not gloating, simply acknowledging the magnitude of the moment. Across the courtroom, Celeste wiped at her eyes, laughing softly in disbelief. And somewhere deep inside the rigid walls of the system, a small crack appeared, not from force, but from the quiet, undeniable power of truth. The final thud of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a closing heartbeat. Suspended. The word pulsed in the minds of everyone present, hanging in the air heavier than any sentence could have been. Judge Roberts leaned back slightly, his expression once again composed but less rigid, as if some internal war had been fought and left visible scars. "This court acknowledges the gravity of the situation," he said, his voice regaining its formal timbre. "However, it also acknowledges the gravity of humanity." He tapped his notes once more. "Congresswoman Crockett, you are free to go." A murmur rolled through the gallery, neither cheer nor condemnation, but something softer, something that sounded like respect, cautious, tentative, but growing. Jasmine nodded once, solemnly, and gathered her things: a worn binder, a cheap ballpoint pen, a battered notebook filled with too many handwritten notes. She didn't look back at the bench. She didn't have to. She had come not to win, but to tell the truth. And in doing so, she had walked away with something far rarer than victory. She had walked away with herself. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung open, and a wall of sound assaulted Jasmine Crockett. The crowd outside was a churning sea of flashing cameras, waving microphones, shouted questions, and raised placards. Some signs were crude insults, others bore slogans of support scrawled in hurried, hopeful letters. Celeste flanked Jasmine tightly, shielding her as best she could from the surge. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you feel vindicated?" shouted a CNN correspondent. "Are you planning to resign?" bellowed another from a local tabloid. Jasmine raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady herself. She stepped up to the first microphone she could find, the mass of reporters surging forward instantly. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly over the din. "I'm not here today to claim victory," she said. "I'm here to tell you that the truth matters. That standing up, even when it's easier to sit down, matters." A ripple went through the crowd. A subtle pause, a shifting of weight, 100 tiny realizations settling into place. "We are not defined by our worst mistakes," Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. "We are defined by what we do after them." Celeste smiled tightly, standing a step behind her, as if bracing for the next wave. Reporters hurled questions faster now, sensing a different story forming, a different angle. "What's next for you, Congresswoman?" Jasmine hesitated only a beat. "I keep standing," she said simply, and with that she turned, cutting through the chaos with slow, deliberate steps. The cameras flashed, the microphones bobbed, the crowd surged, but Jasmine Crockett walked forward, head high, carrying not just her future, but the fierce, fragile hope of everyone who had ever been told they were broken beyond repair. And as she moved through the sea of sound and fury, one truth burned brighter than any headline. She was still standing, and she wasn't done yet. Night fell slowly over San Mateo, the city lights blinking awake one by one as Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her small townhouse. The chaos of the day had receded, leaving behind a profound, aching quiet. She sat on the edge of her couch, still in her black dress from court, her worn leather binder resting on her lap like a shield she was finally ready to set down. Across from her, the muted television cycled through endless news clips. Crockett's courage, a confession that shook Washington, the new face of resilience. Jasmine muted the volume and let the images flicker silently against the darkened room. On the coffee table lay a photograph, her and her mother years ago, arms wrapped tightly around each other, faces flushed with stubborn joy in the face of impossible odds. Jasmine traced the edges of the photo with a fingertip, smiling sadly. "I told the truth, Mama," she whispered into the stillness. Outside, the streetlights hummed. Somewhere a car door slammed. Life, stubborn and ordinary, marched on. Her phone vibrated endlessly with invitations, interviews, speaking engagements, book deals, political consultants eager to rebrand her. But Jasmine wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about the people the cameras didn't show, the single mothers, the scared teenagers, the invisible fighters scraping through every day with a dignity nobody seemed to notice. She stood slowly, setting the binder aside. Celeste walked in from the kitchen, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, and offered it without a word. "You should rest," Celeste said softly. Jasmine took the mug, wrapping her hands around it, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "I'll rest later," she said. She crossed the room to the window and pulled aside the curtain just enough to peer out. Outside, a few reporters still lingered across the street, cameras slung over their shoulders, trading half-hearted jokes to pass the time. Beyond them, the city slept, unaware, indifferent. And yet somewhere out there, Jasmine knew there were kids staring at eviction notices, mothers sitting by hospital beds, families fighting battles nobody would ever headline. They were the reason she fought. They were the reason she would keep fighting. The next morning, she would hold a town hall meeting at a rundown community center on the edge of the city. No cameras, no media circus, just folding chairs and people who still believed. She would show up not because it would fix everything, but because showing up mattered, because truth mattered, because standing mattered. She turned from the window and looked at Celeste, a tired but determined glint in her eye. "Let's get to work," she said. Celeste grinned and nodded. And together they began to plan. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just surviving. She was building a future, a movement, a legacy forged not from perfection but from perseverance. And the world would have to make room for it. Courage isn't about never making mistakes. It's about owning them. It's about standing when it's easier to fall. Jasmine Crockett's story isn't finished. It's just getting started. And so is yours. If her story moved you, inspired you, reminded you of the power of truth, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. More stories of resilience, of strength, of real imperfect heroes are coming. Because the world needs them. And it needs you.